He spoke like a man who knew the script by heart. Steady? Sure. The man in the world believed his daughter had been taken. But over time, the lines broke. Hit subscribe and turn on the bell now, so you get first-hand updates the moment verified new information emerges. Don Wells' conflicting accounts of June 15th. 2021 had become one of the central points of scrutiny in the Summer Wells case. Timelines matter in missing person investigations like nothing else. Minutes define search strategies, alibis hinge on them, and forensic possibilities open or close depending on exact sequences of events. When the primary witness, in this case a parent, offers versions of what happened that don't line up, investigators sit up and take notice. That's not about sensationalism, it's basic case graft. At the heart of the problem are small moments that have oversized consequences. A parent who says a child was in the yard at 6:15 and then says, in another interview, they were gone by 6:10, creates a gap investigators must reconcile. Each variation forces a reevaluation of who was where and when, whether a neighbor might have seen something, whether surveillance footage from a passing car or security camera could show movement, and whether physical searches focus on the wrong corridors of terrain during the most critical hours. In missing child cases, a difference of only a few minutes can determine whether a scent-tracking dog finds a trail or whether it's already gone. Investigators use time slices to build the simplest, most testable reconstructions: who left the porch, when the gate was opened, which vehicle was running at what time. When those slices shift with retellings, the model becomes unstable. There are several possible reasons for the inconsistencies. Trauma and stress distort memory. People under extreme emotional strain often misremember the sequence or duration of events. Sleep deprivation, repeated interviews, and the pressure of media crowds can together blur recollection. That's an entirely human explanation, and one investigators must consider compassionately. It is also true that people sometimes unconsciously adjust their stories to fit a narrative they have come to prefer. Repetition can turn an uncertain memory into something recited confidently. For a parent, the psychological drive to preserve hope or control a public narrative can lead to subtle reshaping of what is said. Separating honest mistake from purposeful deception, however, is what makes investigative work painstaking. Detectives compare statements to phone records, timestamp receipts, video, door sensors, and witness observations to triangulate the objective timeline. In practice, each contradiction triggers action. Detectives revisit and re-interview witnesses with different strategies aimed at isolating core facts unaffected by rehearsed narratives. They review digital evidence, call logs, GPS pings, camera footage, to fix objective moments that anchor subjective recollections. They re-canvass neighbors for corroboration and rerun scent and terrain searches timed against refined windows. In other words, every inconsistent account expands a workload and narrows the useful window for action. From the public's point of view, what starts as a minor detail quickly becomes a smoking gun in forums and comment sections. Within investigative teams is a technical headache that must be resolved before anything else moves forward. The problem intensifies when inconsistencies are amplified by the media. Short clips of a contradictory line can circulate without context, fueling suspicion among people who don't see the follow-up clarifications law enforcement might record internally. That friction between how a family narrates events and how investigators can objectively test them can fracture public trust. The community wants reassurance, certainty that authorities have a coherent narrative, but investigators, constrained by facts and evidence, must often withhold judgment until things are tested. That withholding looks like silence to the public, and in an emotionally charged case, absence of answers is quickly filled by speculation. For the public, the takeaway is unsettling but simple. Memory is messy, interviews are imperfect, and small changes in wording can create a cascade of suspicion. For investigators, the contradictions are signals, not endpoints. and they demand methodical, patient work to turn disputed recollection into verified timeline. The tension between those two truths is what keeps this case unresolved and what keeps the debate, online and off, alive and contested. From the beginning, Don Wells insisted, repeatedly and publicly, that his daughter had been abducted. That insistence shaped the early public narrative and remains a defining element of how outsiders interpret the case. The difference between an abduction scenario and an accidental wandering is not merely academic. It directs who investigators look at, how searches are conducted, what evidence is prioritized, and how resources are allocated. When a parent asserts abduction strongly in media appearances, it creates a public expectation that law enforcement will confirm that story, and that expectation can be hard to reconcile with the slow, deliberate pace of evidence-based policing. There are understandable reasons a parent might adopt an abduction frame. It preserves hope in a way the word lost or dead cannot. It externalizes blame, creating a fight narrative. Someone took my child, which channels grief into action. It also can be a tactical move. When a case is framed as abduction, volunteers, donations, and investigative energy surge. But the role of law enforcement is to weigh that advocacy against physical proof. In Summer Wells's case, authorities repeatedly stated they had not found corroborative physical evidence for abduction. No tire tracks leading from the property that would indicate a quick departure, no surveillance footage capturing stranger activity, and no direct eyewitness account of someone carrying a child from the yard. That discrepancy, the father's visceral certainty versus investigators' cautious evidence-based posture, created immediate public tension. Investigators' reluctance to confirm abduction doesn't mean they dismiss the possibility. Rather, it reflects a scientific standard they must preserve. Detectives must differentiate between what people feel strongly about and what can be tested and proved in court. When a case begins with a family assertion of abduction, police still run to the same checklist. Canvassing the property, checking for footprints and vehicle tracks, seeking camera footage in the area, testing for DNA, and interviewing every potential witness. If those efforts fail to reveal evidence of an outside abductor, detectives must broaden their hypotheses to include other possibilities, including accidental injury, voluntary leaving, or someone with knowledge of the family's routines, each path requiring its own investigative methods.
There's also a reputational dynamic at play. Families who push abduction narratives can be seen as deflecting suspicion, even when their motives are entirely understandable. The public, conversely, sometimes conflates parental insistence with culpability. That social lens complicates investigators' work because it colors how witnesses cooperate, how volunteers prioritize search areas, and even how jurors might interpret later testimony. Law enforcement is painfully aware of these dynamics. That's why statements from agencies are typically cautious, aiming to avoid premature closure while trying to keep the investigative window broad. For the community, the mismatch between parental certainty and the lack of supporting evidence leaves a sense of cognitive dissonance. People want to rally behind resolute declarations of faith in the child's survival, but they also demand transparent evidence. The tension is a recurring theme in missing person cases. Strong emotional narratives can be both a catalyst for helpful public engagement and a source of confusion when they outpace what investigators can verify. The operative question becomes, how should the public balance empathy for a parent's hope with a sober need for proof? In Summer Wells's case, that balance remains delicate and unresolved, and the difference in tone between the father's conviction and law enforcement's restraint has been central to public debate. Don Wells publicly described his daughter as a child who feared the woods, snakes, and animals, details that, on the surface, seem to make wandering unlikely. When a parent frames their child's behavior in such specific terms, it influences how outsiders imagine possible scenarios. A 5-year-old who is supposedly scared of the dark or fearful of wildlife is less likely, in many people's minds, to have wandered off alone. That kind of testimony can be persuasive, but it must be handled carefully. Child behavior is complex. What a parent believes about a child's fear levels might be accurate in the home context, but different in practice during the unstructured moments a child spends playing outside. Children can act unpredictably under excitement or pressure, and they sometimes defy their known fears. A child who is typically skittish around animals may dash after a pet, or a child who dislikes the dark may follow a sibling into the yard without apparent apprehension. Behavioral statements are therefore useful to investigators as context, but they are rarely definitive proof of impossibility. When investigators evaluate such claims, that a child would never do X, they seek corroboration. Did neighbors witness the child's behavior earlier that day? Were there reports of the child being seen playing near a particular area despite stated fears? Did routine photographs or videos show actions inconsistent with the parent's assumed pattern? These are the kinds of cross-checks detectives undertake. If parental assertions about a child's habits align with multiple, independent observations, they strengthen certain lines of inquiry. If not, they remain suggestive but not conclusive. Additionally, emphasizing a child's fears in public statements affects community perception and investigative direction. The narrative that a child would never wander changes where volunteers search, the urgency assigned to particular search corridors, and even the types of expert help requested. For instance, if wandering is deemed unlikely, searches may prioritize areas that would be accessible only to an outside actor, such as roads or frequently used vehicle paths. Conversely, if wandering is seen as a real possibility, search teams might intensify near creeks, hollows, and areas a small child could access unobserved. But there's another dynamic. Public statements about behavior can be weaponized by others as proof of a parent's innocence or guilt. Online commentators sometimes take a parental claim and treat it as definitive, which then fuels speculation when investigators cannot confirm or deny the assertion. This amplifies the already fraught atmosphere. The ethical responsibility falls on both the family and the press to present behavioral descriptions with caveats and on investigators to clearly communicate what they have verified. Across Don Wells's interviews, emotion and grief were the most visible elements. Concrete details about where he was, what he did, and the minute-by-minute unfolding of that afternoon were comparatively sparse. In crisis situations, the public often expects a parent to lay out a clear, factual timeline, but grief does strange things to the mind. When interviews focus on emotion rather than facts, two important dynamics unfold. First, emotional narrative can mobilize community support. A heartfelt plea touches people's compassion and galvanizes volunteers, donations, and media attention. That support is not trivial. It produces search manpower, funds rewards, and keeps the story in the public eye. A strong emotional presence can be a social lever, but it also has costs. Emotional rhetoric can overshadow factual discrepancies or hide gaps that would otherwise be probed more quickly. If a family's public performance centers on grief, without supplying verifiable details, that performance can inadvertently shift investigative priority away from the hard, technical tasks that require precise inputs. Second, emotion-heavy interviews influence public judgment in another way. They polarize. Some people respond with empathy and suspend skepticism, while others view the emotional delivery as a cover for uncertainty or culpability. This polarization is amplified online where short clips circulate without context. An anguished line repeats and becomes a meme, and millions see a moment divorced from the procedural backdrop that informed investigators' responses. In an era of social media, tone frequently trumps content. The consequence is a public conversation that is less about evidence and more about perception. From an investigative standpoint, a witness's emotional state is both a data point and a complicator. Detectives trained in interview techniques must parse genuine distress from performance. They often schedule structured, private interviews separate from media appearances precisely because the latter are not controlled environments for gathering reliable details. The public-facing grief plea serves one purpose. The official questioning aims to elicit concrete, testable information. When those two modes diverge, confusion follows. It's also worth mentioning how repeated media exposure affects memory. When someone repeatedly retells a traumatic event in public settings, small changes can creep into the narrative. Repetition builds confidence, and confidence can be mistaken for certainty even when the underlying memory is unstable. For investigators trying to fix a timeline to a second, these shifts matter. That's why police prefer to obtain details early and in private, before stories have been rehearsed in front of cameras.
From an investigative perspective, child welfare involvement is treated as an important data point, but not a determinant of guilt. DCS records can reveal prior concerns that might be relevant to an investigation, patterns of supervision, prior reports, or documented risks around children. But those records do not, on their own, prove criminal activity. Investigators treat them as part of the mosaic. They compare timelines, document changes in household composition, and consider whether prior welfare interactions point to plausible scenarios for what happened the day a child went missing. For public consumers of the story, though, the presence of DCS removals is often interpreted as moral evidence of parental failing. That interpretation can be unfair and simplistic. Families living with poverty, mental health challenges, or chaotic circumstances can find themselves under scrutiny without criminal wrongdoing. Yet, in high-profile cases, nuance is often lost, and the family faces a double burden, managing the legal intricacies of child welfare, while simultaneously navigating criminal investigation scrutiny and public opinion. The upshot is this. Contradictions in statements about DCS involvement add to the puzzle. They are not, by themselves, proof of wrongdoing. They are, however, another reason investigators will look carefully at caregiving patterns, supervision claims, and relevant timelines. For the public, they are a reminder that family systems are messy and that emotionally fraught administrative decisions can create apparent inconsistencies that need to be interpreted through careful, corroborated evidence rather than immediate judgment. Wrap up what this pattern means and what to watch for next. The common thread through these developments is a tension between emotional narrative and evidentiary rigor. Don Wells's interviews, a mixture of heartfelt appeals, firm convictions, shifting timelines, public fundraising, and personal legal trouble, have shaped the public story as much as the facts themselves. That dynamic has consequences. First, the contradictions and emotional framing have complicated public trust. When investigators must remain neutral and slow, the resulting silence becomes fuel for speculation. That makes the investigative environment noisier and the work harder. Second, many of the actions recorded in public statements, the repeated insistence on abduction, the reward focus, the DUI, the DCS contradictions, are not in themselves proof of criminality. They are, however, legitimate reason for law enforcement to probe deeper, to re-interview witnesses under controlled conditions, and seek objective corroboration via forensic, digital, and physical evidence. Third, the way forward for the public is clear and practical. Prioritize verifiable tips, avoid amplifying unconfirmed assertions, and insist that official channels are the conduit for useful information. For investigators, the task remains to convert conflicting memory into tested timelines through records, timestamps, and corroboration, and to do so in a way that withstands both legal standards and public scrutiny. If you remember anything about June 15th, 2021, specific times, vehicles, faces, or photographs with metadata, report to the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation through official channels. Avoid speculation on social media, and let detectives do the evidence-driven work their roles require. What we've seen in this case is not unusual in its emotion, but is unusual in the size of the public spotlight. That combination creates both opportunity and hazard. The next important steps will be those that produce verifiable facts, not viral conjecture. We will keep watching, and will bring you verified updates as they emerge. Hit subscribe and ring the bell so you'll be notified the moment investigators or credible sources release new, confirmed information.